Hey everyone, welcome back to the English Conversation podcast. I'm Mike, and today I'm joined by my co-host Lily. We're excited to tackle a question we get asked constantly from learners all around the world, and honestly, it's something we both struggled with years ago when we were learning English ourselves.
Absolutely, Mike. We get so many messages from people saying, I studied English for 5, 10, sometimes even 15 years, and I still can't have a normal conversation at a coffee shop or in a business meeting. It's incredibly frustrating for them, and they start to wonder if there's something wrong with their learning approach or if they're just not cut out for languages.
That's exactly it. And what we've discovered through talking to hundreds of English learners is that the problem isn't with them at all. The problem is that most traditional English education focuses on grammar rules, vocabulary lists, and test preparation instead of teaching people how to actually communicate like real English speakers do in everyday situations.
Before we dive deeper, I want to mention that this is a B2 to C1 level episode, so we're targeting advanced intermediate to upper intermediate learners who have decent grammar foundations but feel stuck when trying to have real conversations. That said, if you're somewhere in between, don't worry at all. Just listen along and pick up whatever resonates with you.
One of the biggest misconceptions I see is that English learners think they need to understand every single word they hear. So they're sitting in a conversation, someone says something with vocabulary they don't know, and their brain just panics and shuts down instead of using context clues to figure out what's happening around them.
I did exactly that when I was learning. I remember being at a party, someone mentioned something about their job, and I didn't know one specific word. So I basically just nodded along awkwardly for the rest of the conversation because I thought I had missed the entire thing. But looking back, I only missed maybe 5% of the context, and I could have figured out the rest from what came before and after.
It's such a common pattern. We teach students to chase perfection, and when they can't achieve it, they feel like failures. But native speakers, they ignore words they don't know all the time. They move forward with conversations naturally because they understand that missing one word doesn't destroy your ability to understand the overall message or contribute meaningfully to a discussion.
So let's talk about what's actually different between how native speakers communicate and how most English learners try to communicate. I think one of the biggest differences is rhythm and pacing. Native speakers have this natural flow to their speech, and it's not just about individual words. It's about how they connect those words, where they pause, how they stress certain syllables.
You're touching on something really important here. A lot of English learners study individual words in isolation, right? They learn that this word means this, that word means that, and when they put those words together, it sounds robotic and unnatural because they're not focusing on the melody of English, the intonation, the way words flow together, like a river instead of separate pebbles.
Exactly. And then they get discouraged because even though they're using correct grammar, they still sound obviously foreign because they're missing that crucial element of natural speech rhythm. I actually spent months just listening to English speakers, not studying, just listening to podcasts, videos, audiobooks, and trying to mimic the way they sounded rather than just understanding what they were saying.
That's one of the most underrated learning strategies, honestly. Shadowing, where you listen and try to repeat back what you hear, mimicking the intonation and rhythm as closely as possible. It feels a bit silly at first, but your brain is actually absorbing patterns at a deep level that grammar textbooks never teach you, because those patterns are hard to explain and standardize.
Another huge factor is cultural context. English isn't just a language. It carries cultural assumptions, humor styles, ways of thinking about relationships, business etiquette, social hierarchies. When you learn English purely from textbooks, you miss all of that, so you might accidentally say something that's technically correct, but socially awkward or offensive without even realizing it.
I have a perfect example from my own learning. In my native language, it's considered polite to refuse hospitality twice before accepting because it shows you're not greedy or impolite. So when I first came to an English-speaking country and someone offered me coffee, I said no twice automatically, and they took me seriously and didn't offer again. I was confused until someone explained that this pattern doesn't exist in English culture.
Those cultural misunderstandings happen all the time, and they can actually damage relationships or professional opportunities if you're not aware of them. Like, in some cultures, directly saying no is considered rude, so people soften it with maybe later or I'll think about it. But in English-speaking cultures, that often just means no, and the person might feel like you're being evasive or dishonest.
So the first major adjustment learners need to make is shifting their entire mindset from learning English to learning to think like an English speaker and participate in English-speaking cultures. That's a much bigger undertaking than memorizing vocabulary, and it requires exposure to actual people and actual situations, not just textbook dialogues.
Which brings us to the second big issue, and this one is about confidence and risk-taking. I talk to so many people who have studied English for years but have never actually tried to have a real conversation with a native speaker because they're terrified of making mistakes, sounding stupid, or being judged for their accent or imperfect grammar.
Fear is such a powerful blocker, and I understand it completely because your self-image is tied up in how you present yourself, and switching to another language can feel very vulnerable because you're suddenly less articulate, less funny, less impressive than you are in your native language, where you've had 30, 40, 50 years to develop your personality.
That vulnerability is real, and I think it's important to acknowledge it rather than just telling people, oh, just be confident. Confidence comes from repeated positive experiences, not from having it as a character trait. So you have to deliberately put yourself in situations where you'll have those positive experiences, even if it feels uncomfortable at first.
One of the strategies I recommend is starting with lower stakes conversations. Don't try to make yourself sound impressive or pursue intellectual discussions if you're still building confidence. Instead, have simple conversations about shared interests, hobbies, or daily experiences where you can use accessible vocabulary and focus on just connecting with the person rather than performing.
And you need to choose your conversation partners wisely. Not every native speaker is a good conversation partner for a learner. You want someone patient, someone who's interested in your experiences and perspective, someone who won't correct you constantly or make you feel rushed. A barista at your favorite coffee shop might be better than a university professor for building confidence.
I also think it's really helpful to prepare for conversations, especially at first. If you know you're going to have a conversation, think about what topics might come up, review some relevant vocabulary or phrases, maybe even practice out loud a few times. That preparation reduces anxiety because you feel more ready. And interestingly, when you feel more ready, you actually communicate better.
Preparation doesn't mean writing out a script and memorizing it robotically. It means thinking through possibilities and having some ideas ready so your brain isn't scrambling to come up with something to say while also trying to translate it into English simultaneously. Your working memory can't handle all of that at once, so advanced preparation reduces the cognitive load.
Let's shift gears and talk about what I call the listening comprehension ceiling. This is where a lot of advanced learners get stuck. They can understand English pretty well when they're focusing, reading, watching with subtitles, listening to slow, clear speakers. But in real-life situations with background noise, multiple speakers, fast speech, and unclear audio, they suddenly can't follow anything.
That's such a real problem. I remember going to a movie theater and realizing I actually couldn't understand the dialogue as well as I thought I could because I was used to subtitles and carefully produced audio. I was embarrassed because I'd been telling myself I had pretty good English, and suddenly I realized my comprehension had huge limitations.
The issue is that most English learning materials are optimized for learning, not for real-world difficulty. The audio is clear, the speakers enunciate clearly, the pace is moderate, there's proper microphone technique. But in the real world, you've got people talking over each other, mumbling, using slang, speaking quickly, different accents, background noise. It's a completely different challenge.
So learners need to specifically train for that real-world listening difficulty. That means deliberately listening to podcasts, videos, movies, conversations without subtitles. And it will be hard and frustrating, but that's exactly the point. Your brain adapts to the difficulty level you expose it to. And if you only ever listen to easy material, you'll plateau at that level.
I'd recommend starting with materials that are just slightly harder than your comfortable level. Not so hard that you understand literally nothing, but hard enough that you have to work and you'll miss some words. And you gradually increase the difficulty as you adapt. It's like strength training for your comprehension muscles.
Another thing that's really important is recognizing the difference between active listening and passive listening. You can have English playing in the background all day, but if you're not actively engaging with it, trying to catch details, noticing new expressions, thinking about what you're hearing, you're not actually improving much.
Active listening requires intention and energy. You need to be thinking while you're listening. What did that word mean? Why did they say it that way? How would I say that in my language? What's the cultural context here? That's much more effective than just letting English wash over you while you do other things.
Although I do think there's value in passive exposure too, but for different reasons. When you listen passively, your brain is absorbing patterns and rhythms subconsciously, and over time, that creates intuition about what sounds right and what doesn't. But you can't rely solely on passive exposure if you want to improve actively.
Let's talk about speaking now, because this is where most learners struggle the most. And I think it's because speaking requires you to retrieve vocabulary and grammar from memory under real-time pressure, which is completely different from understanding something written out or recognizing it in a sentence you hear.
Speaking is scary because it's immediate and irreversible. You can't edit what you said, you can't go back and fix it if you make a mistake, and there's an audience, even if it's just one person, reacting to what you're saying in real time. That creates pressure that doesn't exist with reading, writing, or listening.
And learners often respond to that pressure by falling back on preparation or playing it safe with vocabulary they're absolutely certain about. So they end up using very simple language because it's safer, which means they never actually expand their speaking ability beyond what they already know.
To improve speaking, you actually have to be willing to make mistakes and push beyond your comfort zone. You have to try to use new vocabulary even if you're not 100% certain. You have to attempt complex grammar structures that you're still learning. You have to take conversational risks, and most learners are too afraid to do that.
One approach that works really well is speaking with the specific intention of making mistakes and learning from them. Instead of trying to be perfect, you go in with the mindset of, I'm going to try to use 3 new expressions I learned this week, and I accept that I might use them incorrectly. That completely changes the dynamic.
You're essentially reframing mistakes from failures to data collection. A mistake isn't a sign that you're bad at English, it's information about where your understanding is incomplete or where you need more practice. Native speakers correct themselves and adjust their language all the time. It's just part of how communication works.
Another huge factor in speaking improvement is volume. You need to speak a lot, and I mean regularly, ideally daily. But most learners don't do this because they don't have regular conversation partners, or they're too intimidated to seek them out. So let me suggest some alternatives that don't require finding a native speaker to talk to.
Speaking to yourself is honestly one of the most underutilized strategies. You can have conversations with yourself out loud, answering your own questions, explaining things to an imaginary audience, telling stories about your day. Nobody needs to hear it, so there's zero social pressure, but you're still engaging in the act of speaking and retrieving language in real time.
Language exchange partners are another great option. These are people learning your native language who want to trade conversation time with you, typically splitting the time between their language and yours. Websites like Tandem, Conversation Exchange, and others connect learners all around the world. You might find someone in your time zone who wants to do regular exchanges.
And there are also speaking-focused apps and services now. Some offer AI conversation partners that you can practice with. And while they're not perfect, they're available 24/7, there's zero judgment, and you can restart or try again as many times as you want. They're not replacements for human conversation, but they're incredibly.
Let's talk about vocabulary learning, because I think most people approach it completely wrong. They memorize lists of words or they use flashcard apps, and while that can help you recognize words, it doesn't help you produce them or use them naturally in conversation.
I used to study vocabulary like I was preparing for a vocabulary test. I'd learn the definition, maybe learn a few example sentences, and then I'd review the flashcards. But when I actually tried to use those words in conversation, I couldn't remember them or I didn't know how to integrate them into my speech naturally.
The problem is that your brain stores words in multiple ways depending on how you learned them and how often you've encountered them in meaningful contexts. If you learn a word only through a definition and an example, it's stored as a definition, not as something you can easily retrieve and use in conversation.
So effective vocabulary learning requires multiple types of exposure and interaction with the word. You need to see it in context, hear it used by native speakers, understand the nuances and associations, use it yourself in conversation, and encounter it repeatedly over time in different contexts.
This is why immersion or intensive exposure works so well. When you're immersed, you encounter the same words repeatedly in different contexts. You see how they're used, and you're motivated to use them because you're in situations where you need them. Your brain makes more connections, and the words become more retrievable.
For people not in immersion situations, you can simulate that by choosing content, podcasts, YouTube channels, books that are relevant to your interests and engaging to you, because you'll be more likely to revisit them and spend time with them. You'll naturally encounter words repeatedly, you'll see them in context, and the learning will feel more organic.
I'm also a big advocate of learning vocabulary in thematic groups rather than random word lists. Instead of learning 20 random words, learn words related to a topic you care about. If you love cooking, learn cooking vocabulary in context. If you're interested in technology, learn tech vocabulary. This creates semantic networks in your brain that make the words easier to retrieve.
And you should absolutely learn phrases and collocations, not just individual words. English learners often learn single words and then combine them in unnatural ways because they don't know how native speakers actually use those words together. Like, you might learn do and mistake as separate words, but native speakers say make a mistake, not do a mistake.
Collocations are these specific combinations of words that go together, and there are thousands of them. Learning common collocations is actually more efficient than learning individual words, because one collocation gives you multiple words working together, and it's easier to remember and use because you're not trying to construct the phrase from scratch each time.
Let's shift to another major barrier: perfectionism. I encounter so many learners who are absolutely paralyzed by perfectionism. They won't speak unless they're certain their grammar is perfect. They won't write unless they think their word choice is perfect. They're constantly second-guessing themselves, and it's preventing them from actually communicating.
Perfectionism in language learning is actually a symptom of low confidence, even though it looks like high standards. Because a truly confident person knows that perfection isn't possible or necessary, so they're willing to communicate messily and let the message come through even if the form isn't perfect.
The irony is that perfectionism actually prevents improvement because improvement comes from trying things and learning from feedback. But perfectionists are so afraid of negative feedback that they avoid attempting things where they might fail. They stay in their comfort zone where they know they can do things right, but that means they're not learning anything new.
I always tell people that native speakers of English make grammar mistakes constantly. They drop words, they use incorrect verb forms in casual speech, they start sentences and don't finish them. Grammar rules in their minds are more like guidelines than laws, and that allows them to speak freely and focus on the message instead of the mechanics.
As a learner, once you reach a certain level of competence where your basic grammar is solid, allowing some imperfection actually helps you sound more natural because you're focusing on communicating rather than constructing perfect sentences. The goal is communication, not perfection.
This relates to something called acquisition versus learning. You can learn about grammar explicitly through studying rules, but that doesn't necessarily translate into natural, fluent usage because there's a difference between knowing a rule and being able to apply it automatically under speaking pressure.
Acquisition is what happens through exposure and use. Your brain picks up patterns without necessarily having to understand the explicit rule. And while explicit learning has a role, acquisition is what makes you fluent. The two work together, but a lot of learners overemphasize learning and neglect acquisition.
So the balance should be understand the fundamentals of grammar structure through explicit learning, but then do tons of exposure and practice so those structures become automatic. You're not thinking about the grammar while you're speaking. It just happens because you've internalized the patterns through exposure.
Let's talk about accent, because it's something that really bothers a lot of English learners. They worry that their accent is holding them back, making them sound foreign, preventing people from taking them seriously. And there's definitely some truth to the fact that accent carries social meaning and can affect how people perceive you.
But I want to be clear about something. Working on your accent is a choice, not a requirement. Some people have the goal of sounding like a native speaker, and that's totally valid. But it requires a lot of deliberate practice, and it takes time. For others, the goal is clear communication, and a non-native accent is fine as long as people can understand you.
I think learners should distinguish between reducing an accent to improve intelligibility, like if you're mumbling sounds or people can't understand you, versus trying to eliminate an accent entirely to sound native. The first is practical, the second is perfectionism, and it might not be a good use of your energy.
If you do want to work on your accent, you have to practice specific sounds that don't exist in your native language. This requires focused, deliberate practice. You can use apps that analyze your pronunciation. You can get a tutor who specializes in accent reduction. You can do shadowing with native speakers and try to mimic their speech very closely.
The thing about accents is they're actually kind of beautiful. An accent is evidence that you've learned another language, and there's something admirable about that. I've met non-native English speakers with accents who are incredibly effective communicators and leaders because their message is clear and their personality comes through, accent or not.
Now, let's talk about something that's become increasingly relevant: English online and written English. A lot of learners focus on spoken English, but written English in informal contexts like social media, messaging, and emails is its own thing, and it has different rules and conventions than formal writing or spoken English.
Written English online is actually closer to spoken English than formal written English is. People use fragments, incomplete sentences, emoji, abbreviations, casual phrasing. It's much more forgiving than academic writing or formal business communication, so it's a great place to practice and gain confidence.
I'd actually recommend that learners spend time writing in English in these informal contexts, commenting on social media, messaging friends if you have English-speaking friends, journaling, writing reviews. It's lower stakes than formal writing, and you can get feedback from people or your own corrections over time.
But formal writing is a different beast. If you need to write professional emails, reports, essays, that requires much more careful attention to structure, tone, formality level, and grammar. This is actually where studying grammar rules becomes more important because readers can't hear your tone of voice or see your facial expressions to understand your intent.
A lot of learners neglect writing in favor of speaking. But writing is actually incredibly useful for processing language and building deeper understanding. When you're writing, you're forcing yourself to think about word choice, grammar, structure, and you're often receiving written feedback that you can review and learn from.
And here's something interesting. Writing can actually improve your speaking. Studies show that people who write regularly in a language and get feedback tend to develop more accurate and sophisticated language than people who only speak. Writing forces you to be more conscious and intentional about language choices.
Let's talk about anxiety now, because it's something every language learner deals with at some level, and it's not just a psychological issue. It actually affects your language ability. Anxiety narrows your thinking, makes your brain go into a defensive mode where it can't access information as easily, and it can make you forget things you actually know.
I've experienced this where I was anxious before a presentation in English and my mind just went blank, even though I knew the material. Anxiety is a physical response that's hard to control, so you have to manage it before it happens through preparation, practice, deep breathing, and sometimes just accepting that nervousness is normal and doesn't mean you'll fail.
Preparation is huge for anxiety management. When you've practiced something multiple times, you've reduced the uncertainty, and that reduces anxiety. You might still be nervous, but you know you can do the thing because you've done it before. Confidence comes from evidence, from having successfully done something many times.
And I think it's important to recognize that some nervousness is actually helpful. It creates a bit of adrenaline and focus that can help you perform well. It's only when anxiety becomes overwhelming that it becomes a problem, and at that point, you need strategies like deep breathing, positive self-talk, and exposure therapy, where you keep putting yourself in the situation until your anxiety decreases.
Let's discuss language learning resources, because there are so many options now. Apps, websites, podcasts, YouTube channels, tutors, classes. And the problem is that too many options can create analysis paralysis, or learners try a bunch of different things without sticking to anything long enough to actually see progress.
I think the best resource is the one you'll actually use consistently. It doesn't matter if something is amazing if you use it for 2 weeks and abandon it. So you want to find resources that match your learning style, your schedule, your interests, and your budget, and then actually commit to using them regularly.
That said, I do think certain types of resources are more effective than others. Active, interactive resources where you're producing language are better than passive resources where you're just consuming. So speaking with a tutor or language exchange partner is better than only watching videos. But passive resources are still valuable, especially for exposure and building intuition.
The most effective approach is combining different types of resources and methods. You might use an app for structured vocabulary and grammar practice, listen to podcasts for exposure and listening comprehension, have conversations with a partner for speaking practice, watch videos for natural language exposure, and journal or write for written expression.
But here's the key. The most important resource is time and effort. No app or method will magically make you fluent without consistent practice over months and years. Learning a language is fundamentally about putting in the time, and there's no shortcut around that, no matter what ads say.
Let's talk about motivation, because it's the thing that keeps you going when learning gets hard and boring. And it always gets hard and boring at some point. Initial motivation is often external. You want a better job, you want to travel, you want to impress people. But that fades, and you need to develop internal.
Internal motivation comes from seeing the practical benefits of your learning, or from genuinely enjoying the process. Maybe you've had meaningful conversations with someone in English, and that made it feel real and worth the effort. Or maybe you've discovered English language content that you genuinely love. Music, podcasts, books, comedy, and learning English gets you more access to that.
I actually think connecting your English learning to your identity and values is important. Instead of learning English as a task on your to-do list, you can frame it as, I'm becoming a bilingual person, or I'm expanding my ability to connect with people from different cultures and backgrounds. That gives it deeper meaning and keeps you motivated.
Setting specific, measurable goals also helps. Instead of, I want to be fluent in English, which is vague and nebulous, you might say, I want to have a 20-minute conversation about my hobbies with a native speaker, or I want to watch a full TV episode without subtitles and understand it. Specific goals give you something concrete to work toward.
But I'd also caution against being too rigid about goals. Language learning is non-linear. You'll have periods of rapid improvement and plateaus where it feels like you're not making progress. That's normal, and it doesn't mean you're failing. It means your brain is processing and consolidating what you've learned.
This is actually a good transition to talking about plateaus, because there's something most learners experience, and they're incredibly frustrating. You're making progress, you feel like you're improving, and then suddenly it stops. You do the same thing you've been doing, but you're not improving anymore.
Plateaus usually mean you've mastered the things you've been practicing, and you need to increase difficulty or change your approach. If you've been taking beginner classes and feeling good about that, and then you hit a plateau, you might need to find a more advanced class or stop studying and just immerse yourself in English and see what happens.
Sometimes pushing harder doesn't help. Sometimes you need to just keep doing what you're doing and trust that learning is still happening at a level you can't see yet. Your brain needs time to consolidate, to integrate new knowledge, and visible progress doesn't always correspond with actual learning.
I also think plateaus can be opportunities to refocus on weak areas. If your listening comprehension has improved, but your speaking is still limited, shift your focus and practice speaking heavily for a while. If your grammar feels solid, but you lack vocabulary, focus on vocabulary expansion. Plateaus tell you where you need attention.
Let's talk about the role of emotions in language learning, because we often treat language learning as this purely cognitive task, but emotion plays a huge role. The words and phrases associated with emotions are often learned faster and remembered longer than neutral vocabulary because they have emotional weight.
This is why learning phrases that connect to your real life, your actual experiences and feelings, is so effective. If you learn vocabulary in the context of something you care about or something you've experienced emotionally, you'll remember it much better than random vocabulary lists.
And the emotional aspect of communication is huge. Native speakers don't just exchange information, they connect emotionally. So learning to express emotions, to use empathy, to pick up on emotional cues in communication, that's crucial for actually connecting with people, not just technically communicating.
Let's wrap up by talking about how language learning changes you as a person, because it does. When you learn a language, you're not just acquiring a tool, you're expanding your worldview, gaining access to different ways of thinking, different cultures, different perspectives on life. It's actually quite transformative.
And I think that's something learners should keep in mind when they're feeling discouraged or frustrated. Yes, there are specific skills you're learning, pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, but the bigger thing that's happening is you're becoming a more capable, more connected, more open person. And that's really worth the effort and frustration.
I'd also say that your relationship with English will evolve as you learn. At first, it might feel like an obligation or a task. As you improve, it might become a tool for specific purposes like work or travel. But if you stick with it long enough, it might actually become something you genuinely enjoy, and English will start to feel like a normal part of who you are, not something foreign or imposed.
One last thing I want to emphasize is the importance of celebrating progress, even small progress. The first time you understand a joke in English without translating it in your head, that's worth celebrating. The first conversation where you didn't worry about making mistakes, that's a win. These small wins accumulate into major transformation.
And remember that everyone struggles with language learning, even people who seem naturally talented. We all have times when we feel stuck, frustrated, or like we're not making progress. That doesn't mean we're bad at languages. It means we're learning, and learning is hard.
So if you're listening and you're somewhere on your English learning journey, wherever you are, complete beginner, advanced learner, somewhere in between, acknowledge that you're doing something genuinely challenging and interesting. That's something to be proud of.
And we hope that what we've shared today has given you some new perspectives on your learning journey. Maybe there's one thing that resonated with you, one strategy you want to try, one way of thinking about your learning that feels different and helpful.
Before we wrap up, we want to invite you to our community on our website, where you can connect with other English learners, share your struggles and victories, ask questions, and get support from people who understand exactly what you're going through.
We also post additional resources, transcripts of our episodes, vocabulary lists, and study guides on the website. You can find links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, for being committed to expanding your abilities and your worldview through language learning.
This has been Mike, and I'm Lily, and you've been listening to the English Conversation Podcast. Keep learning, keep growing, keep communicating. We'll talk to you next time.